Please welcome Michael Neumeister. Go get him.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Della. Can you all hear me? That's wonderful. Thank you, Della. I also wish to echo Della's thanks of all our sponsors for these exhibitions, these important shows. I also want to extend my gratitude to all of my colleagues here at the museum, especially in the curatorial department, who do so much work behind the scenes to get these beautiful exhibitions up on the wall. European Splendors is something of a celebration for this institution. In many ways, the Crest Collection was the identity of this museum for many decades. And this occasion also does mark a homecoming of sorts for many of these works, because in 2017, when this building was undergoing renovation, we worked closely with the Samuel H. Kress Foundation to conserve about 30 of these objects and really get them ready for prime time in order that they might travel while our galleries were closed. So they've been traveling all throughout the country, and it's really nice to welcome them back here. Which is to say, nearly 30 of the works on view downstairs have not been on view in this building in 5 years. And in thinking about the ways we might hang this exhibition and organize it, I realized, of course, it was very important to look back at our history, at what had been done before, and at how these works came into the collection in the first place. So, as you all know, the Columbia Museum of Art was founded in 1950, and what distinguished us very early on was this generous donation of artwork from the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. Samuel Kress, naturally the famous businessman who owned the five and dime stores that so populated many cities in this country, especially in the South. Kress was a major collector of European, primarily Italian Renaissance painting, also Baroque as well. He also collected sculpture and decorative arts. So in 1954, our founding director, Jack Kraft, coordinated with the then director of the National Gallery of Art, David Finley, who was a fellow South Carolinian. So this sort of auspicious relationship resulted in the first gift of Kress objects to this institution, which constituted about 27 paintings. And in this image here from our archives, which I just dug up last week, we have Robert Manning and Guy Emerson, who I'm told are two community leaders who were instrumental in the founding of this museum, shown alongside the Italian Renaissance scholar Mario Modestini. So they're unwrapping the first gift of Kress artworks in what looks like this sort of peculiar ornamental wrapping paper. I assure you our art handling standards have improved since then. So our Kress holdings were originally put on view in a dedicated gallery space that would come to be called the Trustees Gallery, and this was in the museum's original building on the corner of Senate and Bull Street, the historic Taylor Mansion. And here we have a selection of some of those earliest acquisitions here as they would have been seen in the 1950s up until the early 1960s, and 3 of these works are actually on view in the exhibition downstairs. So at far left, the Orlandi, the Mother and Child, dated to 1290. It's the earliest work from the Crest Collection chronologically. And then we also have at center the Dal Ponte altarpiece, and way at right, this Venetian painting of 5 Christian saints. So 3 of those works are actually on view downstairs. Then in 1962, the museum renovated further and installed additional Kress paintings and objects on this really lush and exquisite velvet wallpaper, which my colleagues tell me was really exceptional. I wish I could have experienced. And the museum would sort of continue to acquire Kress objects, actually up until the early 1970s. So Della said 80. I think it's somewhere between 75 and 80. I'm not sure exactly how many. It depends how you count them. But we have about 45 works on view downstairs. That much I can tell you. And at this time in 1962, and really throughout much of the museum's history, the works were hung chronologically. And really, when we got to this building in 1998, obviously the gallery spaces were, phenomenal, and it was quite a different experience to have these objects here. But again, we took the tact of hanging things chronologically, and here we have the High Renaissance Gallery as it was in 2008, featuring our Botticelli fresco, one of the most important pieces in our collection. And again, late Renaissance through Baroque, mostly chronological. But as you know, since our renovation in 2018, our permanent collection galleries are now organized thematically. So the Kress works that have been on view have sort of been integrated with art across time and place in ways that I think allow us to draw new connections across these works, right? But with all of this in mind, on the occasion of European Splendors, we thought it might be interesting to sort of bridge that gap and between chronology and theme, and to think about ways that we can still communicate the history of the Renaissance and all the important formal innovations that happened in the history of art at that time, but also to do it in a way that was kind of thematic. And it seemed, the idea that we landed on we thought it'd be interesting to take the work of Giorgio Masari, who was an artist and an architect, but also most famous as being basically the first art historian. We thought it would be interesting to take his work as a point of departure and use it as sort of an organizing principle for this exhibition. So Vasari's greatest contribution that he's known for is writing biographies of artists, of Italian artists from the late medieval up until his own time, basically in the High Renaissance. And of course he did so with certain prejudices, and shall we say he was inventive at times. And in some ways we are still contending with Vasari's ideas. It has basically organized the way that we view Renaissance art up until today. And so in this exhibition we're sort of, rather than proposing the rigid chronology that Vasari proposed, we're sort of using some of his words and some of his ideas as sort of points of departure to organize our show. And this is really how it all shakes down in the galleries. So the exhibition is organized into 4 thematic sections, and the first is called Ecce Homo. Excuse me. The title, of course, is derived from Latin, meaning behold the man, or here's the man. Really what we're looking at here is primarily secular portraiture. And the section attempts to speak to that humanist philosophy, the rise of the humanist tradition in the Renaissance. And in fact, the text begins with a quote by the poet Petrarch. So the art historians among you might be saying, Ecce Homo is a trope in Renaissance art. It's a painterly convention, a type of painting that usually depicts Christ before the crucifixion, but after the flagellation. The phrase actually is said to have been uttered by Pontius Pilate as he presented Jesus to the crowd. So it does have these sort of religious and sacred connotations, which are so important throughout the history of the Renaissance. And while we don't have an Ecce Homo painting in this exhibition, the section does attempt to illustrate this idea that Renaissance artists and artists really of this period up through the Baroque were using similar strategies of representation to depict both sacred and secular subjects. The presence of the Tondo painting in this gallery really speaks to that directly on different levels. So the form of the Tondo itself, that circular canvas, was oftentimes a domestic commission, right? It was commissioned on the occasion of major life events like the birth of a child or marriage or something like that. But often, as is the case here, the actual staffage, the themes were religious in nature. So our painting shows the Madonna and Child flanked by angels and St. Francis of Assisi, as well as John the Baptist. So the scene itself is actually imaginal too. It's totally atemporal. The artist is not interested in the idea of communicating a narrative. The artist is more interested in informal concerns. The symmetry of the composition, the symmetry of the arrangement and the figures, as well as the perfection of the circle, the Tondo form itself. This is what took precedence over the devotional imagery. But the second section is called Devotion, and this does look more explicitly at religious subject matter. So among the most important works in the CMA's whole collection, as I mentioned, is the Botticelli, the sort of traditional nativity scene. And it is the only Botticelli fresco in North America, so we always like to mention that any chance we get. But we decided here to flank it in the context of our show with these wooden sculptures, which were probably made 100 years earlier. And so we have the angel Gabriel at left. It's the Annunciation. It's just about to inform Mary of the good news at right. But really the hang in the gallery is inspired by past installations at this museum. So in the 1970s, we had the Dal Ponte altarpiece, which you see at left, flanked by the very same sculptures. So in some way harkening back to sort of the museum's history. And I thought I would show this comparison because it's not often that we get to talk about the Botticelli all the time, but our Nativity is very similar in composition to a lunette, the fresco in a church in Florence. A colleague mentioned this to me, actually. I haven't seen it myself, although I hope to very soon. And in that composition, which I'm showing here at bottom left, it's very interesting because Botticelli has reversed Mary and Joseph, but you'll see that the infant child is always looking at his mother, sort of reifying the importance of that relationship. And because we're looking at religious painting in the second section of this show, we are able to track the development of artistic methods throughout basically the late medieval through the high Renaissance, really through the 16th century. So we have this small painting of the Virgin and Child, which I'm showing at left. Again, the oldest Kress work in our collection, dating to 1290. And thinking about Vasari, this is painted in a style that we call the Italo-Byzantine style, basically using Byzantine icons. The artist is using Byzantine icons as a source. Vasari would have disparagingly referred to this as the Greek manner, right? This kind of flattened, two-dimensional rendering that Vasari basically thought was totally inferior to the art of his own time, thinking of it as very outmoded in style. But when we hang the Orlandi next to a work that it comes 200 years later, we're able to sort of think about the ways in which not only art has evolved, but has it, in what ways has it maybe not evolved? And the painting next to it is from about 1470. The follower of Vincenzo Foppa, who was a significant painter of the Lombard school. And in the same gallery, we have one, to my mind, one of our finest high Renaissance paintings, the Madonna and Child by Andrea Solario. He was also a painter of the Lombard school, though coming after Foppa. So again, we're able to track that lineage here, and you really do get the sense, I think, of that strong human bond between mother and child, which I think presents a wonderful comparison to some of the earlier works in the same section. The third section we're calling Venetian Views. As it happens, we do have a number of exceptional Venetian paintings in our Crest collection. And I think the importance of region in Italy, which of course at this time is just a collection of basically independent city-states, the importance of region in Renaissance art is something that sometimes gets overlooked in surveys of this material. So we thought, why not talk about the ways that the Venetians were distinct artistically from perhaps their Florentine colleagues. So the Venetians are among the first Italian painters to use oil, which was more or less innovated in Northern Europe. So that enabled them to emphasize the subtlety of color and really use color as a means of creating depth and modeling, whereas their Florentine colleagues would have been emphasizing drawing or design. Really in the service of the same end goal, right? Working toward linear perspective, toward sculptural forms in two-dimensional surfaces, just a sort of different approach. And we are also fortunate, of course, to have paintings of the Venetian vedutisti, so the view painters, the Canaletto and the Guardi. And also, you might note that we're showing one painting here that is not by a Venetian, the Giovanni Paolo Pannini, really at center there, was not a Venetian painter at all. He worked mostly in Rome, but he was a view painter. And again, this display harkens back to something that the museum did historically. So way back in 1954, these same three paintings were shown in tandem, basically in conjunction, in a similar format. So finally, the exhibition concludes with a themed gallery that we're calling Allegory and Artifice. And as I was researching the show, I learned that Vasari used a very interesting term in his writings to refer to artists. It was somewhat unusual even for his time. He used the Italian word artifice, which actually doesn't really have an immediately recognizable colloquial English translation, but in Latin, it derives from the word artifex. And that was used often with reference to God the Creator, like Deus artifex. And so in thinking about Vasari's language, I think it connotes something about his view on artists. It sort of articulates this idea of artists as makers and artisans, but also as genius creators, right? Suggesting perhaps that artists are divinely inspired. And Vasari's words, as I mentioned at the top of the talk, have kind of oriented us and the ways we look at Renaissance art since his time, for like 400 years. So maybe it's not by accident, the words that he was using. And for all the reasons that Vasari rightly heralds the artists of his own time for their formal innovations, the innovations in perspective and so on. It's also very interesting to me that Renaissance artists were often depicting precisely the same subjects that are already very familiar to art history for hundreds of years prior. So biblical scenes, classical scenes, and allegorical themes, really. So what we're proposing in this section is that artists are always creating images in ways that are responsive to their times, in ways that are linked with the sort of the prevailing ideas and philosophies of their day, and even sometimes as are a result of the pressures of their times. And in this gallery, we're showing this work by Francois Boucher, which we're very fortunate to have. It might illustrate this idea because we could, of course, talk about the arrangement of this painting, the formal solutions that Boucher utilized in balancing this sort of complex multi-figure composition. But we could also think about the reasons why Boucher painted this biblical subject in 1723, because we do understand that Boucher, at this early time in his career, was very much trying to fulfill his ambitions as a history painter. He's working toward acceptance in the sort of rigid French academic system, and it was really necessary for him to paint subjects like this to gain the respect of his peers, to win the Prix de Rome, which he did right around this time. So as much as Boucher is fashioning a world in his art, that world is being fashioned by external forces in some respects. Because Boucher, of course, is an artist that we most closely identify with the Rococo, and these later paintings like this one at the Louvre, which we sometimes think of as frivolous and playful and colorful. Interestingly also again, sort of Greco-Roman themes, right? These were the kinds of paintings that garnered Boucher the real fame, okay, in his time. And I just think that in our exhibition, hopefully in the context of our show, we hope to present his work and also the work of really all of the artists in the show in a slightly different light, and hopefully to inspire some new avenues of interpretation.